Good evening, everyone. I'm Kristen Buckles, Editor-in-Chief at the University of Arizona Press. Welcome to our event, Rewriting the Chicano Movement, a book celebration and discussion. Joining our conversation tonight are editors Ellen McCracken and Mario Garcia, as well as contributors Tiffany González, Jesse Esparza, Holly Barnet-Sanchez, Andrea Muñoz, and Michael Turcios. On behalf of the University of Arizona Press, I want to thank Mario and Ellen and our guests for generously sharing their time with us tonight. The University of Arizona Press is the premier publisher of academic, regional, and literary works in the state of Arizona. We disseminate ideas and knowledge of lasting value that enrich understanding, inspire curiosity, and enlighten readers. We advance the University of Arizona's mission by connecting scholarship and creative expression to readers worldwide. Rewriting the Chicano Movement is a collection of powerful new essays that expand and revise our understanding of the movement. These essays capture the commitment, courage, and perseverance of movement activists and their struggles to achieve the promises of democracy. Mario T. García is Distinguished Professor of Chicano Studies and History at the University of California, Santa Barbara, specializing in Chicano history, Chicano and Latino autobiography, the Chicano Latino, and Chicano and Latino religion. He is the author, co-author, and editor of more than 20 books in Chicano history, including Blowout, Sal Castro and the Chicano Struggle for Educational Justice, The Making of a Mexican-American Mayor, and Literature as History. He has won a number of awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship. Ellen McCracken is a professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at the University of California at Santa Barbara, specializing in U.S. Latino and Latin American literature. Her books include New Latina Narrative, The Life and Writing of Fray Angelico Chavez, and Paratext and Performance, and the novels of Junot Diaz and Sandra Cisneros. And now, without further ado, I'm pleased to turn the Zoom stage over to Mario and Ellen, editors of this fantastic new book.
Thank you very much. And buenas tardes for those of you in Pacific time, and buenas noches for you in the other time zones. I want to thank Kristen for her introduction. Kristen Buckles is a wonderful editor, and University of Arizona Press is a fantastic press and one of the leading presses in terms of dealing with Chicano and Latino studies. And I want to thank Mari Herreras for organizing the presentation tonight and for all of her hard work. And of course, my co-editor, Ellen McCracken, I want to thank her. And of course, the participants, the contributors, I want to thank them very much. And of course, for the audience, for those of you that are watching us this evening. What I'm going to do is make a few comments in terms of an introduction to the book project, and then I will introduce the participants, the contributors, and who will then briefly share a summary of their essays. So the origins. This is a book composed of 10 essays, and the origins of the book come from the 2018 conference that I organized called the Sal Castro Memorial Conference on the Emerging Historiography of the Chicano Movement. That 2018 conference was the fourth in a series of conferences on the Chicano Movement. The first was in 2012, and then I've organized 5 others every other year. And the reason I did that was because I began to see an emerging historiography, an explosion in many respects of younger scholars and others who were beginning to examine and re-examine the Chicano movement. And so as a result, I was able to put together these conferences. Now the Chicano movement, of course, as I tell my students, is the largest and most widespread civil rights and empowerment movement by people of Mexican descent in the United States in the late 1960s and into the 1970s. The movement was reacting to a long history of racism and discrimination against people of Mexican descent. but it was also reacting to the fact that even before the Chicano movement, there were others who were struggling to achieve social justice and to achieve civil rights. You had earlier groups like LULAC and the American GI Forum and many others prior to the Chicano movement. But the movement, led by a new generation, the Chicano generation, expanded the dimension of these earlier struggles. The Chicano generation was focused as well on achieving a new and empowering identity for itself, to make people feel good about being Mexican after they were told in the schools and other places that to be Mexican was bad. And so the movement, of course, it manifested itself in many areas. So many of you know some of those areas, the farm worker struggle, the struggles in schools highlighted by, for example, the 1968 blowouts in East Los Angeles, but walkouts in many other areas of where Chicanos lived, the efforts to achieve political influence through the establishment of an independent political party, La Raza Unida Party, the efforts to protect undocumented immigrants, the cultural struggles through the so-called Chicano Renaissance, was the emergence of a strong Chicano feminist movement. The movement achieved many breakthroughs. It created many new opportunities for Chicanos in education, especially in higher education, in politics, in the arts, in the media, and business. Among these things, what the movement did was to make Chicanos international political actors. And it is my belief that the roots of contemporary Latino political power in the United States today lie in the Chicano movement. Now, rewriting the Chicano movement, the book that we put together, is not an attempt to in any way suggest that the movement was anything less than it was. It begins with the premise of the Chicano movement, one of the most seminal moments in the history of Mexican Americans in the United States. And it builds from that. It expands our understanding and knowledge so that we have a better appreciation of how wider spread it was and the depth of its dimensions. For example, in the conferences that we've held, we've seen new subjects that relate to the movement: women, activists, artists, rank and file people, not just the top leaders. We've seen regional diversity. We see the Chicano movement not just Southwest, but in the Pacific Northwest, in the Midwest. We've seen linkages of the Chicano movement with other social movements. We've seen the internationalization of the Chicano movement in terms of relations with social movements in Mexico or in Cuba. One thing that has been noticeable in our conferences, and it's highlighted today as well, is the interdisciplinarity approach to the Chicano movement. So we've had presentations from historians, from people in literature, people in art history, from media studies, religious studies. And all of this is also focused with seeing the Chicano movement as a part of American history, that it is American history, and relating it to American history. The last thing that I'll say in this introduction is about the legacy of the Chicano movement. The Chicano movement was a historical movement, but what remains is its legacy: the struggle for civil rights, the struggle for social justice, the struggle to further democratize the society, especially with the continuing efforts to prevent people from achieving full equality and democracy. And we've witnessed those in the last 4 years under the nightmare of the Trump administration. And God thank that we're out of it. But those efforts to roll back efforts in civil rights and so forth are still there. And I think what's important about the legacy of the Chicano movement is that hopefully it will empower others today to look back and see that it can be done, that people can struggle, continue to struggle, and that the need for struggle is still there. So with that, we want to turn into the different chapters or essays in the book. And the first one is one that I wrote And so I'll just briefly mention, it's a chapter that tried to give the book a little bit more in depth or dimension, or so that we can see that the movement builds on earlier struggles. In some of my research, I found a very interesting, well, let me mention the title of that chapter that I'm mentioning. It's called Precursors of the Chicano Movement, Walkout, 1936 El Paso Strike. In some of my research, I found that in 1936, so in one of the elementary schools, there was a war of 19, where some of the students reacted to the few teachers who seemed to be work well with them and who treated them well was removed. And so they decided to go out on strike in order to try to have her come back into the school. And so they were successful in doing that. But it was a remarkable story that as early as 1936, we had a preview of what we would see, for example, in 1968 with the walkouts in East Los Angeles. So that's the chapter that I contributed to kind of a little bit more dimension to the next chapters that deal specifically with the Chicano movement of the 60s and 70s. So let me now introduce our participants and the title of their essays, as well as some of their background. First, Tiffany Jasmín González, and her background is she earned her PhD in history from Texas A&M University, College Station, and earned an accolade from the American Association of University Women for a dissertation entitled Representation for a Change, Women in Government and the Chicano Movement in Texas. And Tiffany currently holds the Bonquist postdoctoral fellow in women's history at the Newcomb Institute of Chilean University. Tiffany's essay is entitled Breaking Barriers for Inclusion, Chicanos Running for Public Office, and the Chicano Civil Rights Movement in Texas. So Tiffany, if you will.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction. And hello, everybody in attendance today. Thank you for making the time to hear about this wonderful anthology that has been produced. So my essay about breaking barriers for inclusion, Chicanos running for public office, and the Chicano Civil Rights Movement in Texas kind of conceptualizes the work and the important work that Chicanas did in Texas, and showing how important that was during this time to kind of understand what's going on in the 21st century, with a lot of Latinas, Mexican-American women in Texas running for public office across the state once Trump won election, right? This backlash that was created for women of color, but specifically what I write in my article is that the bedrock, right? The structure that has been built was by Chicanas in the during the Chicano movement. And I argue within my essay that the movement in itself was also a fight for political representation in government and electoral politics. And I provide with a lot of, beginning with La Razón y the Party, when I was doing research and speaking with many of Chicanas that were involved, right? Even the fight to be that the platform in itself was that had Chicana representation, make sure that it was total family involvement, men, women, and children. And also the leeway of that platform, making sure that women were running for public office there in Crystal City in South Texas. And that also shown my essay how this formed the women involved in the Razón y the Party. Then they go into working with the mainstream women's movement at this time to advance the cause of Chicano liberation and women's liberation as well. This to fight for representation, getting involved with the National Women's Political Caucus and the Texas Women's Political Caucus, and how working with the mainstream for advancing Chicano liberation and Chicano feminism was a way for them to also be able to receive information of what's going on at these mainstream organizations to advance, right? To advance women's political representation and their civil rights for the whole community. And what I found, doing research in that, connecting the networks, is that the overarching story, what I write in my monograph, and in this, I give a little bit of snippet in this chapter article, is that Texas, we had the first Mexican-American woman elected into the state representative in 1970. She ran in 1976, won, in 1977, Representative Irma Rangel, right? And so her story of how she ended up in office relates to meeting many of the Chicanas who were involved with the Chicano movement at a conference in 1975, the Women in Public Life Conference, where Martha Cortera, in Texas and, across the Southwest, she's well known for being a staunch Chicana feminist, very vocal about her beliefs and advancement in civil rights. Gave a powerful speech there at the Women in Public Life Conference about the position of where Chicanas were with representation in government and the lack of actual representation, the lack of actual mobility they had to advance compared to white women during this time. And after her speech, a lot of Chicanas and Mexican American women came together, and that's when Irma Rangel ended up meeting Pauline Martinez, Chicana from San Antonio, who was involved with the civil rights movement there, the Chicano movement, and also the Mexican American Business and Professional Women's Association, who encouraged her to run. And Irma Rangel ended up creating, with the networks through the Chicanas and the Texas Women's Political Caucus and the National Women's Political Caucus, and doing grassroots campaign. She launched her campaign and won. She was in office until 2003 when she passed away from cancer. So my essay overarchingly shows this linkages, right, of how the Chicano movement and the Chicanas involved with the movement are so impactful to encourage other women to run for public office. And this fight is about political representation in government and electoral politics. So that's the bedrock of what I write about in my essay within this anthology.
Okay, thank you, Tiffany. Our next presenter is Holly Barnet-Sanchez, who, along with Tim Drescher, who couldn't be with us tonight, wrote their essay entitled Taking Chicano and Solidarity Murals Seriously. Holly Barnet-Sanchez is Emeriti Associate Professor of Latin American and Chicano and Latino art history at the University of New Mexico, the author of several publications focusing on Chicano murals and graphic arts. Her most recent co-authored book with Tim Drescher is Give Me Life, Iconography and Identity in East LA Murals. Tim Drescher is an independent scholar specializing in community murals and political posters. And so, Holly, if you will please make your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Mario and Ellen and Kristen and Mari for setting up this, this panel this evening. It's really a pleasure to be here, and Tim sends his regards. This photograph is of what we call the Olympic Boulevard facade at Estrada Courts housing project in Boyle Heights, parts of East LA. The photo was taken somewhere between 84 and 86, I can tell by the cars. Left to right of these murals are We Are Not a Minority, the Black and White Moratorium mural, and The Artist, all painted, well, in the 70s, and We Are Not a Minority in the 80s. We take for granted now that there are exterior murals in locations such as housing projects and alleyways, in parks, various external locations. At the time these murals got started here and elsewhere in the late 60s, early 70s, painting them at all and painting them on building exteriors in working class neighborhoods was a revolutionary act, phenomenologically different from earlier frescoes and murals painted in the Americas or elsewhere. These new murals were painted with and by the community. That is, it is community-based art making, but we also have to understand it is also art-based community making. And that's really how the murals help to contribute to the movimiento itself. Tim and I had a specific goal in this essay, building upon our book, which was to note what Chicano movimiento murals do. How do they make meaning? We sought to examine the ways in which The murals, often multiple simultaneous meanings, emerge dialectically from the relations between their content and their multiple contexts. In this case, with a focus on the intrinsic context of location and architectural settings through a close reading of selected murals in the two 1970s mural clusters at Estrada Courts and Ramona Gardens housing projects in East LA, along with the 1980s Solidarity murals in Balmy Alley in San Francisco's Mission District. This geographic and spatial counterpoint also serves to situate the specifically Chicano Movimiento murals within the broader international community murals movement of which they are a part. This evening, I wanted to focus for the panel on Estrada Courts, where there are 90 plus murals, primarily like the ones you're seeing here at 18 by 23 feet, in close proximity to each other on the ends of large two-story apartment blocks, and also along the 4-foot high walkway walls that encircle most areas of the courts. As you can see, there are numerous murals that face outwards, away from the projects, about 14 altogether, toward the busy Olympic Boulevard and Lorena Street. They include the most activist Chicano images in the courts, in direct conversation with each other and the surrounding communities of residents, civic authorities, youth gang members, commuters, and mural aficionados, addressing La Raza, the high school blowouts, Vietnam, international solidarity, farm workers, La Virgen de Guadalupe, the Pachuco Cross, the pre-Columbian past, and the very real cycle of life and death. The more numerous murals facing inward speak most directly to the court's residents, including members of the local VNE gang and administrators of the courts. They include memorials to fallen gang members, a gang logo mural next to one of Aztlán, community celebrations, the awakening of the farm worker, a Chicano power banner in a Mexican folk art environment, children's fairy tales and adventure stories, differing Native American imagery. Those two contrasting yet overlapping sets of murals also converse and play off each other, setting forth the many intersecting and contrasting components of Chicanismo in an additional dynamic dialectic. Our analysis of these murals, which we do at each site, reinforces the significance of location and architecture for Chicano Movimiento and other community murals that are never separate from their environment, always specific to their communities, while often always or also speaking beyond themselves, addressing other times and different territories. Thank you.
Thank you, Holly. Our next presenter is my co-editor, Professor Ellen McCracken, who is a professor of Spanish and Portuguese at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She is the author of several books on Chicano literature, including New Latina Narrative, The Feminine Space of Postmodern Ethnicity. And she's a co-author of Roque's Corner, The Life and Times of Roque García and his Santa Fe.
Thank you, Mario and Kristen and Madi and all the people at the press who worked so hard to make this book come out. A lot more happens than just us writing it. And thanks to everyone who's taken the time to listen to our presentations tonight. So my essay in the book begins from the premise that movement history should not just be about the famous leaders, the intellectuals, the literary figures, political figures, and so on, that the stories of the ordinary people, the little people, are very, very important to include in Chicano history, because without them, there would have been no Chicano movement. If you just had some leaders urging people to do something, nothing would have happened. So the second premise is that a lot of people thought that New Mexico wasn't too involved in the Chicano movement, that those were just people who mainly focused on Spain and Hispano culture. And we learned that there was a lot of going on in New Mexico in the Chicano movement. So it's a rewriting of that history in that sense. And the figure that I write about in this article is a man named Roque García, who was born in 1937 in a rural town in northern New Mexico. Roque almost didn't make it. He could have ended up a pinto in the prison system because of a lot of troubles he had when he was young. There's a picture of him on the right, and we'll get to who that is, the other figures are in a minute, but grew up in extreme poverty, had an inferior education, and drops out of school at age 14 after his first year of high school. He got involved in a youth gang who got into trouble, Los Corchos, they called themselves, and he engaged in a lot of petty theft jobs and burglaries with them and with his brother, his older brother. So he drops out of school and goes to Flagstaff. I won't bore you with all the details, but when we get to the 1960s, he is a recipient of the wonderful War on Poverty program started in the Lyndon Johnson administration. And in 1964, he gets trained in a cooking school in Santa Fe. And New Mexico Senator Joseph Montoya comes to the school and has the delicious food that Roque and the others are making and invites Roque to come back to Washington with him to start a restaurant, a Mexican restaurant in Washington, D.C., because Montoya misses the food. So Roque, because of this War on Poverty program, this opportunity, gets to start becoming a cook, and he starts this restaurant. Well, he comes back to New Mexico eventually. I won't go into all the details because we want you to buy the book and read it. But in 1966, he meets Reyes Lopez Tijerina, whom you see here in the center of this photograph. And he starts to become involved with the work of La Alianza in the land grant movement in New Mexico. And as many of you know, that was a movement to reclaim the lands that belonged to the people of Hispano descent, going back to the time Spain conquered what they called the New World at the time. And Roque had been involved in that land grant movement, but Reyes Lopez Tijerina took it to another level. And so he participated in 1966 in the takeover of the Kit Carson National Forest. And then after the courthouse raid in 1967, he sheltered Tijerina in his house while he was running from the law effectively, and they were trying to figure out what to do. In the summer of 1968, another important element of the Chicano movement, he got involved in the Poor People's Campaign and took a bus all the way across the country with hundreds of other Chicanos, Blacks, Native Americans, people the have-nots in American society. And since Roque, he met Jorge González and other leaders. And since he was a little bit older, he took on a number of leadership roles in those 3 months that they spent in Washington, D.C. And he spoke at rallies outside the federal buildings. He introduced Coretta Scott King, who spoke to the Chicanos who were staying in the Harvard School at the time. And he met, as I said, other Black and Native American leaders, and this was really important in his formation as a Chicano and as a political activist. When he returned to Santa Fe, he became a community organizer in another government program, the Model Cities programs, which funded monies to inner cities to try and give people jobs and to make life better for people in these cities. And he was involved in anti-drug programs. He organized youth activities. He later became a home health aide. And then he, in the 1980s, ran for city council in Santa Fe 2 times. He lost both elections, but he led a good campaign. He brought up a lot of issues, and that was sort of the culmination of his involvement in the Chicano movement. The picture of Jesse Jackson, where he's introducing him, was in 1988, and he presented Jackson with a statue of San Martín de Porres, a santo, because santos are so important in New Mexico, as a remembrance of this first Black saint of the Americas from Peru, San Martín de Porres. So after he ran for city council, he, in 1984, he changed his profession. He set up a food cart in the plaza of downtown Santa Fe. He was the first person, one of the first people to do it. He had to fight to get permission. He used some of his political connections to do it. And then Roque became famous, a famous figure in Santa Fe, with this food cart that makes delicious beef carnitas with peppers and on a warm flour tortilla. And he became an institution in Santa Fe. He got national media coverage at his food stand in magazines like Bon Appetit and Gourmet and Vogue. And one couple from New York who flew their private plane into the Santa Fe airport took his food back frozen for a party they were having. So everybody knows Roque in the Santa Fe Plaza, but they don't know this story of his background in the Chicano movement, which helped him to survive in a very harsh environment that he grew up in. He notes that he's still on the plaza today. He's in his 80s. Every day he goes and works from 10 to 2 with his food cart and his old truck, and he still encounters racism. Youth gangs a year or so ago came up and called him a little wetback, and it made it into the newspaper. And tourists often say to him, some tourists say, "You speak English really well. You know, how long have you been here?" And of course, he's a native New Mexican who was born and raised in Santa Fe. So in conclusion, I think what this article, this essay shows is that one of the have-nots from the second poorest state in the United States in terms of household income, how his life was changed by his participation in the Chicano movement, his participation from the ground up. He was one of the early people in that movement. And also, how he was a high school dropout. He had a hard time. He struggled to earn a living to this day. And yet he blossomed into a grassroots leader in struggles around community issues that he still does in Santa Fe today. And the second main takeaway from my piece in the collection is that New Mexico was important in the Chicano movement, and maybe it has been overlooked previously, but we need to focus and do research on the history of the many Nuevo Mexicanos who participated in the movement and are continuing to participate in politics today. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Ellen. You've kind of whet our appetites for dinner, I think, but with Roque's burritos. Our next presenter is Jesús Jesse Esparza. The title of his essay is Chale con la Guerra, the Chicano Anti-War Movement in Houston, 1965 to 1975. Jesse Esparza is an assistant professor of history at Texas Southern University. His area of expertise is the history of Latinos in the United States with an emphasis on civil rights. His current book project is Raza Schools, Latino Educational Autonomy and Activism in Texas, 1920-1980. So Jesse, if you will.
Yes, thank you, Mario. And my apologies, I seem to have was disconnected and I reconnected, but my video is not working for some reason. So I hope that that's okay and you bear with me here for a moment. But yeah, as Mario indicated, the title of my talk or of my chapter is Chale con la Guerra, and I look at the anti-war movement in Houston, and I focus specifically on an anti-war march that occurred in July of 26, 1970, and I look at that as a specific case study, and I situate it within the larger anti-war movement of the period, right? That is of the Chicano movement. And so what I do then is I open up briefly about the march, and then I bring it back to address, what were the issues that brought Chicanos to that moment in Houston in July of 26, 1970. And so I begin to address sort of their tragic living experiences, right? I talk about aging infrastructure, dropping property values, abject poverty, certainly there's segregation, police violence, mass incarceration, and, you know, those kinds of things. And then when the war begins, right, they sort of assume the role of cannon fodder. And so Chicanos began to protest and Ortega Park this war, and they very immediately see it as an imperialistic war. They begin to take issue with the draft and argue and believe and feel that they are disproportionately drafted into this conflict. Certainly, right, they need no convincing that this war is an illegal war, and they point to the search and destroy missions conducted by the U.S. forces in where you see sort of these civilian communities sort of destroyed and depopulated as a result of American sort of illegal activity there. But the thing that most galvanized Chicanos rates that they suffered, again, right, making the case that their casualty rates were proportionally higher than any other ethno-racial group involved in this war. And so Chicanos protested, and they did so in several ways. For starters, they held these anti-war rallies. There we go, there's my video. For starter, they were rallies. They ran interference at induction centers, and they even operated anti-draft counseling centers, like, for example, the one that I looked at was the Southwest Regional Draft Counseling Association. And this was basically an organization that was designed to help people get out of draft notices or to help them appeal the draft, because there was problems when they submitted these deferments. And so that the other thing that they did then, as I sort of began to open up with the essay, was as they held these marches, like the one that took, which started out with about 20 or 30 people, and then ended as the persons that I interviewed for this project, ended with about 1,200. We'll have over 1,000 Chicanos marching through the streets of the Second Ward, one of the most historic areas in Houston. They're holding signs and banners, and they're carrying flags and a coffin, all of this representing those, the Chicanos that were killed in the war. Shouts of Raza Si, Guerra No, and Chicano Power, and Viva la Raza could be echoed throughout the community. And this march was organized by activists and individuals and organizations such as Mayo, the Mexican American Youth Organization. Certainly the Brown Berets in Houston were a big part of it. Have Brown Berets coming in from other places, San Antonio and Corpus Christi. I spoke to Ray Rodriguez. He was a carnal, a Brown Beret carnal out of Corpus Christi. He would come up and help protect birds. And so what is also happening is, you'll have Greg Salazar, more local activist from the Northside People Center. And then this march would coalesce at a historic park there in the Second Ward, Hidalgo Park, what the people call Mexican Park. And they would hold a rally filled with fiery speeches. And, a who's who of Chicano activists would be present. Dr. Luis Cano.
I lost his audio because there's too much video.
An activist, an educator in the Houston area is there as well. As is Albert Peña, comes from out of San Antonio. Bexar County Commissioner Al Peña is there, and he gets the people fired up when he calls the Vietnam War a gringo war, those kinds of things. And so I do all these kinds of things to explore this anti-war movement. I talk also briefly about the multi-generational and multiracial coalitions that would take form as a result of this movement, right? I mentioned middle-class mainstream activists like Leonel Castillo, for example. He's with PASO. But then you'll also have non-Chicanos who participate in this movement. You'll have members from the Student for a Democratic Society, SDS, Gloria Rubach and them, they're there. You'll have students from SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, they're also there. And so you'll have some coalition building taking place. It doesn't last long, but it's there and it should be mentioned. And then I sort of begin to wrap up with talking about how this anti-war movement is going to widen the existing rifts within the Mexican American community. There were already rifts within that community, and the war and then the anti-war movement is further going to widen that. And I sort of begin to talk about how veterans and and activists and begin to sort of bump heads in many ways. And so and then I sort of have this last piece and where I try to place an emphasis on the use of oral histories, because that's what I used to write this essays. I talk to activists of the period, and I try to reposition oral histories as historical authority, one of the things that I mentioned in the essay. And so, but that was my chapter, Chale con la Guerra, and we hope that you buy the book, and we hope that you read all the chapters. Thank you, and I apologize for the tech issue, but I hope it was worthwhile. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to turn now to Andrea Muñoz and her essay in the book, which is entitled Blowout, the Testimonio of Mita Cuaron and the 1968 East Los Angeles walkouts. Her BA in Chicano and Chicano Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and I'm proud to call her one of my students. At the 2018 conference where we had these presentations, Andrea had the distinction of being the only undergraduate to present, and she presented with tremendous, greatly. And so she is now currently a Teach for America member, and after her teaching commitment, will attend graduate school. So Andrea, please.
Hello, thank you, Mario. Good evening, everyone. I am Andrea Muñoz. I was an undergrad student when I worked on this essay, and it's titled Blowout, the Testimonio of Mita Cuaron and the 1968 East Los Angeles school walkouts. It centers on Mita Cuaron, who's pictured on the screen there. She was a student at Garfield High School who helped organize students to challenge the inferior conditions at the schools as part of a larger blowout in the East Los Angeles schools as part of the Los Angeles Unified School District. It's important to note that it was one of the largest mass protests by high school students in the history of the United States. This oral history testimonio attempts to show the importance of Cuaron's role as a Chicana in the walkouts, as well as it's a larger story to recount her life. To organize my research, I did utilize an oral history testimonio. The testimonio is a narrative. It emphasizes oral discourse. We're focusing on a single speaking subject, and we're portraying her experience in the name of her group or her class. I overall want to highlight Mita's life story to emphasize herself as a Chicana participating. Of course, we're moving past different focuses, and really we want to show and reconceptualize overcoming popular stereotypes of Mexican women in the Chicano movement. In the testimonio, we navigate starting with her family roots, and we move into her growing up in East LA. You can see some of on the left side of the screen, some insight into her community organizing spaces as a child. She participated with other children her age, but also she was involved in different organizing spaces when she tagged along with her father, Rafael Cuaron, who was very active in other organizing spaces. We do focus a lot on her transition to Garfield High School, and I'm showing her high school ID on the image, something that you will read. She was actually accused of being an outside agitator by other folks and who were at the walkouts. And this is just one of the ways that she had to prove herself, that she was in fact a student during all of this. At Garfield, she was a member of the Garfield Strike Committee. We learned all about how it was formed, and we get a little bit of an insight into what the daily routines were, how they communicated. And we also learn how the Garfield Strike Committee had a bigger communication an organization with Sal Castro and the other high schools as well. In the blowouts, we really get to live the history through Mita's perspective as a young Chicana and as an organizer. Not only does she recount her experience of walking out, but also the intricacies of what happened in the evenings and nights following, because it wasn't just a one-day event, it was days and nights. So Mita does recount in her testimonio, and this is something that I thought was really interesting, how as a result of the blowouts, there were some students who were not allowed to sleep in their homes because their parents were not understanding. And the image on the top right shows how students actually slept over at Mita's house because she did have parents who were more open and understanding. And there were nights where they just had lots of people sleeping in those living rooms. We also, so that was some consequences that other students faced. In terms of Mita didn't have to face that specifically, but she did have to face other repercussions. She was arrested following the walkouts, and you get to see what that was like in her own words. And she also had to face suspension from school for being an organizer. And so really what we're doing in this oral history, you're getting to see the intricacies of the everyday, not only for the walkouts, but also we continue with her life afterward. And she does eventually move away from East LA to the high deserts for some time, and then eventually makes her way back to Los Angeles, where she focuses on her art. So right now she is a nurse, but she also focuses a lot on different art pieces. And then on the screen, you can see some of her current work and some of her past work that she did during the 70s. And that is all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Wonderful pictures. And our next presenter and final presenter is Michael Anthony Turcios. The title of his essay in the book is The Chicano Moving Image on Walls and Media Activism. Michael is completing his PhD in Cinema and Media Studies in the School of Cinematic Arts at USC. He specializes in the visual and literary culture of subaltern groups from the Global South. His dissertation is entitled Art of Displacement, Decolonial Visual and Literary Culture in the East Los Angeles Barrios and the Bagnoles of Paris, France. So, Michael.
Thank you, Mario, and good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's been an long afternoon. First and foremost, I would like to thank Mario García and McCracken as the editors. And at University of Arizona Press, I would like to thank Kristen Buckles, Mari Herreras, and Elizabeth Wilder. Thank you so much for assisting us throughout the process. My chapter, The Chicano Moving Image on Walls and Media Activism, emerges from archival material from discrete sources that include the UCLA Chicano Studies Research Center digitized collections and the Cal State Los Angeles East LA Archive, where I consult the materials in the collections of the Anthony Quinn files. So I began my essay with an event that took place on November 5th, 1970 in Beverly Hills High School, where Chicanos and Chicanos organized the Mexican American Conference at Beverly Hills. And at the conference, speakers such as Rey Andrade, who was the former Green Beret and the chairman at the time for Justice for Chicanos in the motion picture and television industry, or Justicia, delivered statements on the inequities and injustices in the entertainment industry of the early 20th century, and at the time, the 70s. And so my chapter proposes that we consider the Chicano moving image as a theoretical framework for studying the unconventional and yet important historical role that murals played in other forms of visual culture that the televisual and cinematic channels were not giving the Chicano movement. And so I specifically study murals in order to place emphasis on the intertextuality and the intermediality of the social movements for liberation that took place in urban space, specifically the barrios, but also in other urban spaces like the Black ghettos at the time. But more specifically, I call attention to the perception and the mobility of muralism. In this chapter, I look at the murals and how they were more than just decorative, large-scale pieces in adorning the bland walls of urban space. But rather, what I do is I look at the particularities of the cinematic elements embedded in them, including the televisual. So this would include looking at the ways in which the muralist and the community members were part of this effort to bring in televisual and cinematic elements in the murals in order to give us a different perception of what was not presented on screens, both the small screen television and the large silver screens. And so in this chapter, I take as case studies Willie Herron's and Gronk's Moratorium, the black and white mural of 1973, and David Botello's Read Between the Lines, Cuídense Amigos from 1975. And I see how these two murals, the cinematic and televisual elements, are used in the service of liberation. And in both murals, we see that they openly critique the mass media and in particular film and the television industries. And this is at the time as well that scholars and community activists and writers that were, they were also publishing this material in newspapers and magazines such as La Raza, where they were asking the community to critique these televisual and cinematic references. But they were also doing something interesting in that these murals, when we think about it in its totality, the murals also played a big role in the mass media activism that was taking place at the time, although understudied. And this is where I want to insert murals in this history of televisual and cinematic forms of activism. And so the images at this time, when we think about the visual culture, catalyzed a radical visual culture that inspired the community to decolonize and to engage politically, but also to create desires and images of alternative reflections and those that reified self-worth. What I do here with the term Chicano moving image, I claim it from film and television, and I argue that the Chicano and Chicano artists, with limited means of the cinematic and televisual tools, they were instead using these the paintbrushes and the walls in order to create something that resembled cinematic scripts and television screens. And these artists were working with limited means already. And overall, what I do with this methodology of putting these murals together and thinking about the history of where these murals belong in media activism, I ask us to consider in general where we might find moving images. For example, we might see them in posters, we might see them in silk screens, in cartoons, and in other forms of visual culture. And so at this time, considering the proliferation of visual culture, it is important to look at the cinematic in these other pieces, and also to understand the struggles at the time, specifically the contemporary struggles against representation, because visual representation was so important, especially in the Chicano movement. And so when we think about visual culture, I ask us to also consider where can we find these and how can we contextualize them and situate them in a study of the Chicano movement, but also visual culture and other disciplines that are more traditionally conservative. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I just want to mention briefly the other three essays in the book and their authors, so that the audience gets an opportunity to see a sense of the full book. One of the other essays is by Omar Valerio Jimenez from the University of Texas in San Antonio, and the title of his de la Reconquista, the Brown Berets Contest Memories of Conquest, 1971 and 1972. It's a wonderful look at a part of the Brown Berets that we often have not focused on, their role as revisionist historians. In 1971-72, in a period of a few months, they traveled into the Southwest in places like going to Santa Fe, going to Brownsville, Texas, and other locations where they challenged the way that the history of Chicanos had been represented in those locations, and to show how Chicanos had actively resisted aggression against them, racism against them, discrimination against them, And so in a very physical way that they played out a new way of looking at the history of these locations. So it's a one essay, and we'll get more details by reading the full chapter. One of the other essays in the book is by Juan Mercado. Juan Pablo, who received his PhD from UCLA, teaches Chicano history at Chabot College and at San Jose State. And his essay is entitled From Siqueiros to Spark, the Historical and Ideological Roots of a Chicano Mural Movement. And this is also a wonderful essay that links the past with the present. And what Juan Pablo suggests is that contemporary artists in the Chicano movement, and specifically focuses on Judy Baca, one of the great artists of that period, and how she directly and indirectly was influenced by the work of the great Mexican muralist Siqueiros, who in the 1930s came to Los Angeles and did some incredible murals, most specifically a mural called America Tropical, was attempted to destroy because it was a very radical, very militant view of history, challenging American imperialism and colonialism, and also the struggle for social justice in the Americas. And so what Juan Pablo suggests is that artists like Judy Baca, as they became aware of the mural by Siqueiros, were encouraged by his emphasis on, again, the struggle for liberation, the struggle for social justice, and so that there's a linkage, he argues, between Siqueiros and the work of Judy Baca, and her great mural, The Great Wall of Los Angeles, which was done between 1974 and 1983 over the summers, in some ways is a testimony to the influence of Siqueiros. The other essay that, in the book is by Patrick Fontes, and Patrick received his PhD in American history from Stanford, and he currently teaches at Clovia Community College in Fresno. And his essay is entitled, We Were in a Foreign Land, the Chicano Movement in Fresno County. And so this is one of those articles that expands our understanding, in this case, of the Chicano student movement from its better known locations, such as Los Angeles, to other parts, in this case of California, in the Central Valley, in Fresno, in Fresno State, and how the Chicano students there in the early 70s began to organize and to struggle to have a voice on that campus. And one of the things that they wanted as a voice was to have access to the student newspaper of the campus. And so over a period of time, they pressured the university to give them the opportunity to have their own publication within the premises of the student newspaper. But Patrick expands that also to note that the students at Fresno State were the children of farm workers. And so they're linked also to the struggle of the farm workers led by Cesar and Dolores Huerta at that period, at that time. And so it's a quite revelatory essay with respect to the Chicano movement in the Central Valley. So these 10 essays then compose the book, and as I mentioned, it's an attempt to rethink the Chicano movement, rewrite the Chicano movement, but building on a recognition that the movement was one of the most seminal movements in the period of Mexican Americans in the United States. It opened up many new opportunities. It showed that Chicanos could make history, and they did make history, and they struggled to bring about positive changes, and those struggles need to continue. So in many ways, the book, there's a praxis to the book, I would argue. We want people to be aware of the book. We want people to read and to think about what is written in the book. And then most importantly, to act on the meaning of the book. What is the legacy of the Chicano movement? How can I carry on that legacy in a period of time where we're still faced with tremendous efforts to deny Chicanos and other Latinos and other minorities and many, many other Americans the full rights that they are deserving and the full rights to a democracy. So with that, I want to again thank all of the contributors. I have not seen some of them for 3 years since the 2018 conference. They all look very well and healthy despite the pandemic. So I hope that continues. And so now we're going to be moving into the question and answer period. And hopefully many of you out in the audience will have questions either for specific participants, discussants, or in general. So from there, we'll turn it back over to Mari for the Q&A.
Thanks. You guys were all so wonderful. Thank you for the presentations and the visuals too. Andrea, Anita Hernandez wants to know, how did you meet Mita?
Yeah, so I met Mita in one of my undergrad courses. A professor who was a friend of hers brought her in to speak to us. And when she came in, I was like, I need to learn more about this person and like her experience and everything. And I tried to do a quick Google search. I was like, I have to find something about her, and nothing. I could not find anything. So that's something that just like stuck in the back of my head. And speaking to Professor Garcia, he was working with me on an honors project, and I was like, well, I do have this something that has been itching at me. So that's how it came to be.
That's great. One of the questions that came up is if any of you came across any other histories that you were interested in, but you were focused on the topic at hand that you decided to focus your research on. Are there any others out there, unwritten histories in the movement that you think you'd like to go back to in the future? And if so, why?
So anyone who wants to participate, I mean, one thing that I would say, what we need is biographies, especially biographies, key people, not only major, but like in Ellen's paper, people that were more the rank and file. We need these kinds of stories, and they can be done either biographies or as Andrea did it, as a testimonio, as a life history based on oral history. So we need to know more about the individuals who were involved. And also, as our book mentions, and as the conferences have suggested, the Chicano movement was not a monolithic movement. There were many Chicano movements, and we need to know more about how the Chicano movement manifested itself in a whole variety of communities. Our conferences in this book began to showcase some of that, but there's still many communities where the Chicano movement was there, and we need to know more about how that played out.
Does anyone else want to speak on that at all? Okay, I have another question from Luis Alberto. In general, how may we continue on with the legacy of the Chicano movement?
Well, that's something that I was hoping to raise with all the participants. So I'd like to maybe just go very quickly around and have each of you say just a sentence or two about what you think the legacy of the movement is from your perspective. So Jesse, do you want to begin with that, or just picking you out?
Yeah, indeed. I think that the legacy, of the fight for social justice, right, is I think certainly one of the key things, right? I mean, we look at police brutality, for example. At the time that I was writing this essay and finishing writing this essay, I mean, we had another young man in Houston killed, at the hands of HPD, right, Nick Chavez. And so, social justice and the continued fight for social justice, I think, is one of the legacies that comes out of the Chicano movement, the ending police brutality. Certainly, we can look at immigration, right, when we sort of think about the refugees in our current presence, right, and certainly, right, the sanctuary movement that would emerge in the 1980s and 1990s. That comes out of real life experiences of those church occupations here in Houston, in Los Angeles, and in Philadelphia, and that sort of transitions into the sanctuary movement. Those church occupations do, and so this continued fight for social justice and its continued fight for righting the wrongs, I think, is one of the legacies of the Chicano movement. I can go on and on, right? I mean, we can talk about education and Chicano studies and the attack on Chicano studies and ethnic studies, and we can talk about education, MAS in K through 12, right? But so there's several actual legacies of the Chicano movement, certainly. I'll keep it brief.
I'm glad you mentioned Chicano studies, because I failed to mention in talking about the accomplishments of the movement that, of course, Chicano studies comes out of the Chicano movement. It is part of the legacy of the Chicano movement. Let's do, Tiffany, what would you say, in your opinion, is the legacy of the movement for you?
I'm sorry, Tiffany had to leave.
Oh, that's right.
Sorry about that.
Andrea, why don't you address that as well?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Jesse is saying. And like me, I'm currently a teacher. I teach 6th grade math, and I can see a lot of what Mita had in her story specifically about fighting for educational equity in different communities. And I'm seeing how that is still going on today. So I think, just as he was saying, we can see it all around us.
How do you see from your perspective, the legacy of the Chicano movement?
Definitely. I agree with my colleagues that one thing that seems to be a common thread is that it's offering the language, the practice of the Chicano movement is offering the language to look at coalitions that occurred but were understudied. So here I'm looking at, for example, the ways in which the coalitions that happened between Chicanas and Chicanos with the global South in Latin America and the Caribbean, and even the ways in which Chicanas and Chicanos were making sense of their situation, the civil rights movement, and also their occupation of urban space as a continuation of the colonial regime. So here at this time, they're also writing about expressing solidarity with the African colonies and also with the Middle East. So not only are we just getting the language, but we're also looking at the histories that are understudied and buried, and the work that remains to be done in all aspects, from healthcare struggles to education, and also looking at the ways in which the imperial and colonial struggles also were affecting urban space of the global North.
Mm-hmm. And Holly, from your position in New Mexico and working with artists, what do you think? How do you see the legacy of the Chicano movement still at play?
Oh, well, in New Mexico, it's always a very interesting phenomenon. And it's in play. It's interesting because here you have the Hispano experience, which doesn't necessarily acknowledge the Chicano experience. But you also have now a Chicano studies program at UNM. It was called a number of things over the decades. And it's very active, and it has a graduate program. And the issues of immigration, of housing, of education, of healthcare, of being a sanctuary location, that's all part of it. And so I think it's really important here. And in Albuquerque, the movimiento itself was very active during the 70s and 80s. And the Southwest Organizing Project is still here and still functioning. I'd also like to speak about something a little closer to your home right now, and that's the effort to save the Ortega Park murals. There is a park in Santa Barbara, California called Ortega Park, and murals started to be painted there in the 1970s by several artists. The most prominent was Manuel Unzueta, who's still out there. And Parks and Rec's department is making an effort to upgrade the facilities, the sports facilities, but what they sort of barreled through and just sort of said, well, we're just going to have to lose all the murals, and there are 18 of them. And so there have been several conversations with different city agencies, and we've all been testifying and meeting with city people. But what it amounts to is whether the history and the culture of Chicanos in Santa Barbara have value, whether they should be at the table making decisions and not having others make decisions for them. And the African American community is coming together now with the Chicano community about this park, because the park is in the east side, and the park is a historic park. And it was like the park was being kept there geographically, but removed to make a regional park that was being gentrified, and the community was being ignored. So the murals themselves are a marker for something much more important in terms of who has a voice, who can speak, who can make decisions. So that's a very concrete issue that we're fighting right now.
I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you very much. And so, Mari, turning back to you for other questions.
Yeah, Dr. Esparza, let's see, hold on for a second. I need to scroll down. Someone was asking about where did you get the video that we showed, the clip?
Oh, yes. So that's Cynthia Roscoe. Hey, Doc.
Yeah.
Yeah, I received that. That's footage that was shot of the parade. It was shot by one of the persons that I interviewed, Ray Rodriguez. Ray Rodriguez is I think he's a former director of Centro Aslan, which is an agency here in Houston that helps Chicanos and other working class communities. And he was in the jungles of Vietnam in 1967. And then he comes home. He's originally from Corpus Christi. He comes home and he goes to college, and he joins Mayo there in Corpus Christi, and has what we refer to as sort of this change in consciousness. And he was there fighting this fight, and then come home and sort of understands that the war was illegal and some of the things that I addressed. And so he, with other Mayo activists, they sort of created this network, and he came to Houston and he supported the march that took place in July 26, 1970, partnered up with Mayo activists here in Houston and other activists like the Brown Berets and so forth, and provided protection. Nothing happened in terms of violence or police repression. I mean, the police were there, they were taking pictures, opening files, that kind of stuff. But yeah, he shot it. It's on a Super 8, and that's why it's sort of like that. I had to slow it down because it was very, very fast, and there's no audio to it. But it's his. It was gone. He shot it that day. He hadn't seen it again until I interviewed him, and then we went looking for it, and we found it. And so it's back with its owner. I have a digital version. What you saw was the digital version, but he has the original piece with him. I'm trying to get him to donate that to an archive. It shouldn't be with him, or at least he should consider then putting it in a place where they can preserve it for 1,000 years. And that's where these interviews that I did, that's where they go to. They go to this archive. I hooked up with the archive here in Houston, the Houston Metropolitan Research Center, and they've been wonderful partners in helping me uncover this hidden history. Thank you for asking that, Dr. Roscoe.
That's really cool. This is a question for Holly and Anthony. Does graffiti play any role in the Praxis legacy of Chicano muralism?
Michael, why don't you start on that one?
Yes, I'll be very brief in that. Concede to Holly. It does actually, and it's very interesting. When we think about the ways in which graffiti plays a role, or even political phrases in the creation of these walls, there's plenty of work. But to direct you to one, Eric Chavez, Gronk's "The Wall That Cracked Open" is actually a mural where he encouraged passerbyers to write their name on the wall, or even to tag on it. And we see that in many of the Chicano and Chicano murals of East Los Angeles, specifically, that in the context that I know of. But it's also about reclamation. So the writing on the walls is a form of reclamation. And it's about naming, and the act of naming the individuals of that community and themselves, right? But it's also about representation. So it does play a role, and it's interesting when we also think about the political phrases that appear at this time as well. Holly, I have more to say on this topic.
Well, it's interesting because yes, graffiti, Mexican American graffiti is directly connected to mural making, particularly in the housing projects. because the way that young Chicano activists sold the housing authority on making the murals, putting up funding, was this was graffiti abatement. But they kind of snuck around that. But if you look at Estrada courts and you look at all the pre-Columbian imagery on the walkway walls that are almost nothing is there now, but what that pre-Columbian imagery was a protection around the project, and it was a stand-in for the placas and other graffiti of the V&E gang. In fact, there used to be something that looked like geometric pre-Columbian painting, and it just kept saying V&E, V&E, V&E over and over again. So it was both replacing, but ensuring that the gang itself was still present. And in East LA, and in those murals, in those housing projects where each project has its own gang, the graffiti was essential, because the graffiti, as Marcos Sanchez Tranquilino pointed out, graffiti in those projects were a way of protecting against gang violence. It was a way of saying that this is how many people we have here, and you don't want to attack us. And so the pre-Columbian imagery helped to keep that sense going. And so it's key, the relationship. Now, graffiti murals, New York Wildstyle murals, that's an entirely different phenomenon. And both of them, they all exist, but it's not the same as the Mexican-American gang graffiti, which is absolutely integral in Los Angeles. Not necessarily everywhere, but it is a Southern California phenomenon.
I'm so sorry, y'all. We are running out of time for additional questions. We're at the end. And if you've had a chance to scroll chat, you'll see that there have been other great questions and comments. This audience has been wonderful, and I appreciate everybody's comments and cheers and really great questions. Want to thank you so much, Mario and Ellen, and contributors, Tiffany, Holly, Jesse, Andrea, and Michael. Your essays, I can't wait to take a dive into the book. My copy just arrived today, so it was good timing, huh? And I just want to thank you all for sharing your time and scholarship with us tonight. Tonight's event could not have happened without the support of my colleagues at the University of Arizona Press and our University of Arizona Libraries family. A special thanks to Kristen Buckles, our editor-in-chief, for tonight's introductions. We hope to see you at our next event, which is on Wednesday, March 10th, with celebrated anthropologist Carlos Vélez Ibañez, in conversation with anthropologists that work on trans-border anthropology. For more information, and also where you can purchase tonight's book, you can go on our website, which is uapress.arizona.edu, where you can also purchase the book and find out about next events. And also the video will be posted from tonight will be posted on our website as well. And big thank you to everyone who joined us. Really, really appreciate you being a part of tonight. The best part of publishing books like Rewriting the Chicano Movement is the opportunity for us to share them with all of you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Mari, and thanks to everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Good to see everyone. Take care of yourselves.
Bye.